Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I am Rick Bennett. Did slavery exist before Christopher Columbus came to the Americas? Yes. Did Europeans make Native Americans slaves? Yes, as well. We're going to talk about this untold history of Native American slavery with Dr. Thomas Murphy of Edmonds College. You won't want to miss it. Check out our conversation. All right, well, so by the way, I guess you had a co-author on this essay in the Gospel Topics essays. Can you tell us just a little bit about your co-author?
So we're talking about the essay here. And
oh, you've got your copy. I don't have mine yet.
You don't have yours yet? Oh.
Yeah, it's on order, but I haven't gotten it yet.
Yeah, I got them from Signature. But my co-author is Angelo Baca. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Angelo Baca is a PhD student in anthropology at NYU, at New York University. And he's a Navajo and Hopi. And grew up LDS. And, his mother was in the Mormon Indian student placement program. And actually, as a kid, he lived in Provo and then lived out here in the Northwest and Tacoma area. And Angelo and I actually met right after, during that publicity, during that time that it was all over the news. Angelo reached out to me. He was an undergraduate student in anthropology at UW, and I was a graduate student at UW, just finishing up my PhD. And he reached out to me, so we started talking, and then we collaborated on a film. He finished his undergrad in anthropology and then started a master's program in communications with the Native Voices filmmaking program. And so we collaborated on a documentary film that I highly recommend over the DNA versus the Book of Mormon. It's much more balanced perspective, and it's more from an indigenous perspective. And that's called, in layman's terms, spelled L-A-M-A-N instead of L-A-Y-M-A-N. Clever play on words by Angelo. Mm-hmm. In layman's terms, looking at Lamanite identity. And that film...
Is that on YouTube, by the way?
It's on Culture Unplugged, so you can find it for free to watch on Culture Unplugged.
Okay.
It's one of those films where the filmmaker Angelo plays a very active role, and so it's kind of self-reflective, and so it's kind of his story combined with the story of indigenous Mormons, and so he interviews a number of people, and we went to New York together. And this was actually very interesting because after that DNA versus the Book of Mormon video came out, that same ministry contacted me wanting to do another book on the Bible versus the Book of Mormon. And I was kind of reluctant to do it. And so I gave them some conditions, and they wanted me to go to New York with them. And I said, I'll go to New York, but I want you to pay for Angelo to come with me, and he can work on his film too, and cover our expenses. And so they did. They paid for Angelo and me to go to New York. And they later paid for my wife and me to go to Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras.
Wow.
So I got some nice travel out of it. But then this film, I think they did a better job with. But my main goal was to help Angelo. And so we got, an expense-paid filming trip of Western New York. So, we got to go to places like Palmyra and so on. But for us, it wasn't just Palmyra, just very near Palmyra. A lot of Mormons don't realize this, but Ganondagan is a very famous Seneca town site, just a dozen miles away from Hill Cumorah.
I always thought it was Canandaigua. I say it wrong. It's How do you say it?
Canandaigua is a different place. Ganondagan is it was a prominent Seneca Village in the 17th century. There was a big invasion by the French in the 17th century. That's where all those, Joseph Smith grew up finding those artifacts of iron and steel and stuff mixed with native artifacts. That was the remains of the Ganondagan conflict in the 17th century that was scattered all over the Ganargua Valley. And so, his kind of perception of Book of Mormon societies was shaped by the 17th century remains of the Seneca Village. That
when you say his, you're talking about Joseph Smith or somebody else?
Smith's conception. Okay. Yeah, you know how in the Book of Mormon it gets all the wrong plants and animals and the wrong technology? Well, those were already incorporated in Seneca tradition in the 17th century. And so they were using horses, they were using steel and swords. And when you read the kind of the pioneer accounts of artifacts that they were finding the farmers were finding in their fields, just in the neighborhood of Cumorah, in the Ganargua Valley where Joseph Smith used to go fish as a kid. These artifacts are all over the place. So you have, more traditional technologies mixed with European technologies. And apparently Joseph Smith misunderstood that European technology, which was a recent introduction, as being of ancient origin. But anyway, we went to Ganondagan and interviewed Pete Jemison, who is a caretaker for the Seneca Nation at the state historical site. And asked the Seneca what they think about the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is almost 200 years, right? Mm-hmm. Since the publication of the Book of Mormon. Almost. We're getting close. Yeah. And how many Mormon scholars have actually taken the time to go sit down with the Seneca and say, what do you think? How does this story situate with what you have to say? Well, to see Pete Jemison's actual words, you can check out the video, but I'll give it the best summary I can. But kind of the issue that Angelo was asking him most about is this idea that there had been this great ancient destruction, this battle in the area of Hill Cumorah. Was there this great ancient destruction where the ancestors of the Senecas wiped out this white nation of Nephites? And Pete Jemison's like, we didn't do that sort of thing. We didn't, we had warfare, yeah, but we did not destroy a whole nation. When we attacked other people, we saw that we had a social responsibility for taking care of those families of ours that were lost, but also of taking care of those families that we harmed through that conflict. And so traditional Seneca warfare, the casualty numbers were very small. And it was more important to capture an enemy than it was to kill them. If you can capture them, then you can decide. Actually, the clan mothers would decide: should we? Are they a threat to our society? Should we execute them, basically, or should we adopt them? And so part of that question of whether they'd be adopted or not, part of it rested on kind of the needs of the community. Do they need people of that age and gender and so on? But also of the way the captured person behaved and responded. And the clan mothers would decide then, well, we want to welcome you into the family, or, we want to send you elsewhere.
Well, let me ask you this. I know, I'm trying to remember what the name of the book, I think it was called Establishing Zion. There's a story in there, a horrible story about, especially in Deseret or Utah, the Indians would capture other Indians or Native Americans. I probably should use Native Americans. I know some people don't like that.
Okay. Indian is what most indigenous people in this area use is Indian. They recognize it's a misnomer coming from Columbus, but it actually has legal meaning. American Indian is defined in U.S. law So if you're a federally recognized tribe, you are legally American Indian. So,
Okay.
and that term is colloquially used. So no worries.
Okay, good. But I just read a book by Darren Perry on the Bear River Massacre, and he said he didn't care either way about Native Americans or Indians, but some people do. So, but at any rate, so I know that when the Indians were used to, when they would capture other Indian tribes, and then they would sell them to the Spanish as slaves, and the Spanish would purchase them and keep them as slaves. And then when Brigham Young came out here, the Mormons were like, no, we're not going to do that anymore. And there's a story in there of a Native American that had two Native American children that were captured from a war and tried to sell them to the Mormons. And the Mormons said, no, we're not going to do that. And so he executed the one child in front of them and said, if you had any heart, you would have saved this child's life. And so then they were like, oh. So there was some slavery as well, at least in Native American cultures, wasn't there?
Yeah, so this is a topic, I wrote a little bit about this topic in my dissertation and in a current book I'm working on. So this is a topic of particular interest to me. So I'm glad you brought it up. But it's, let me say that what was happening with the Haudenosaunee is very different than what was happening with the Shoshone and Ute. And there was the Ute warriors that story is about. Okay. With the Haudenosaunee, it was very different. It was a way of replenishing the population because of disease and war, that it had a devastating impact on the society. So the people were welcomed into the family. They learned the language. They became members of the family. They became citizens of the Haudenosaunee Nation. Some of them were in, this is a democratic nation. That is, they had elected officers, and some of these adoptees became sachems or elected officials, and or even clan mothers or Guntawisis. And so they became full citizens of the nation, would be the way to put it. Now, what was happening in Utah was a little bit different. There you have a Spanish slave trade that was, built upon this older practice, the older indigenous practice of capturing people in battle. That existed before the Spanish trade. Okay, so right. More similar to what was going on with the Haudenosaunee. But with the Utes and the Paiutes, so there, the struggles between the Utes and Paiutes, especially in what's now southern Utah, and
so Utes and Paiutes are like the same tribe, but they're
related,
enemies?
Right? Yeah, they're related. Okay, but the difference was that the Utes were the ones who adopted more quickly the horse technology and the technology that was introduced by the Spanish. And so they used that to their advantage and would capture Paiute children mostly, and then sell them in Santa Fe and in other Spanish colonial communities. And these kids became the Genisados, or the kids that were adopted and purchased and became basically servants in these Spanish households. They got disconnected from their indigenous heritage and incorporated into that Spanish and Mexican culture. Well, in the interactions with the Mormons come in. There's this thriving slave trade, and so Wakara sees this is a great economic business relationship, possibility, and so. They seek, customers. They see Mormons as customers to purchase, because the Spanish are buying these slaves, so maybe the Mormons will too. And those stories of the brutality, some of those are late stories. Some of those are stories I think that Mormons use to justify the practice, because I think that Mormons were somewhat uneasy with this idea. But there were African slaves brought west with Mormons, and there was actually a native slave. And this or servant at least, I should say, because they often use the term slave to refer to the Africans and servant to refer to the American Indians.
But the Indians were slaves essentially, right?
Yeah. So my wife, Carrie Sumner Murphy, she's a direct descendant of Penina Shropshire cotton wood. So Penina is a Cherokee woman who was a servant in the household of Daniel Wood in Nauvoo. Okay.
Oh, really?
So these stories where Mormons say, "Oh, the Utes made us do it." Wait a minute. Mormons were doing this in Nauvoo before they came west. And so Penina was a servant. Daniel Wood describes her as orphaned, and in his autobiography, and is kind of wishy-washy about the details of her, how she got into the household. Some of the later accounts call her a hired girl, but very clearly she was a servant to take care of his first wife, who was sick and bedridden, and so into the household as this caretaker, and she converts to LDS Church. One of the first Lamanite, they say, converts to the church. In fact, her descendants, my wife's family, say that she was the first Lamanite to enter into plural marriage. She went through the Nauvoo temple, married Daniel Wood, and so she went the servant to the second wife. And then she came west with the Mormons, or with that second, it was the second wagon train coming west. And when we try to say, okay, the Utes made us do it, how do we explain Penina? How do we explain that there was already a slave trade in Illinois, also with relationship to the Spanish, who had, temporarily controlled the St. Louis area, and it was the struggles between the French and the Spanish for this area. So when Mormons came into Illinois, there was a similar slave trade in Indian women and children, so that practice, nobody was threatening Mormons to do this. They were already participating in a larger cultural practice. They come west, and then the Utes are engaged in a similar practice. Well, there's a thesis that kind of looks at demographically the number of people, and so a number of these kids that were adopted by Mormons were sold, but not all of them. A lot of the kids, in fact, Penina took care of two Ute children that were orphaned by conflict at Fort Utah. And so these were orphans in war that Mormons took. Mormons were capturing Indian children and bringing them into their households, not just purchasing them when forced to by Ute traders. But Mormons were actively engaging. And in fact, Brigham Young does go back and forth in terms of how much to embrace it. But in the end, he says, this is a great opportunity. Let's buy up these children, buy up these Indian children. We'll make them white and delightsome. And bring them into the Mormon homes. And in fact, in 1852, the Utah legislature legalizes slavery, and they also legalized basically, I guess the way to describe it would be indentured servitude. That's the word I'm trying to come up with. Indentured servitude for Indians. And the idea was that Indian children would become indentured servants, that Mormons had to take the responsibility for educating them, although that wasn't enforced. But they had to take responsibility for educating them, and had to free them after a certain number of years. I think when they were about 20 years old or something. Yeah. If I remember, get the details correct.
I know Paul Reeve is coming out with a book on the 1852 legislature, and I'm sure that the act in relation to servants is going to be talked about, because there were differences between black slaves and Indian slaves. Just as you said, Indians were treated better. How's slavery a good thing? But better than black slaves were. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, I went off on a long tangent there.
That's why it's gospel tangents.
Yeah. Right. Mormons like to remember that they were the brutality of the Utes, but they don't like to remember our own brutality, right, and our own role in that process. So I think we were talking about Angelo Baca and Haudenosaunee, and somehow we got to Utah.
Yeah.
Well,
the reason why was we were talking about the different. So it sounds like the Eastern Indians were different than the Western Indians, and maybe the Western Indians were more into slavery than the Eastern. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, because of that Spanish influence. Because both in Illinois and in the Great Basin, there had been Spanish colonization, and so the Spanish influence created a market for slaves.
So did the Spanish bring slavery to, I guess, what was Mexico? Is that can we blame the Indian slave trade on the Spanish?
The slavery of Indians? Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now, English did it too.
What about before the Spanish got here? Is there any evidence for Indian slavery before the Spanish arrived?
So I don't really like to use the term slavery to describe that. It certainly wasn't what they call it, chattel slavery. People were not bought and sold. Okay, it was more like what Mormons did in the Mormon Indian Student Placement Program, fostering, adoption, and so there were those practices here in Coast Salish country. There was a class-based system where captives from other nations had kind of this lower rung on the social ladder that involved a fair amount of labor for the benefit of the community. So it's similar in that sense, but it wasn't the buying and selling of slaves that you see from the Europeans. And so that kind of market economy side of slavery, that's what's unique to the European introduction.
The Spanish brought the buying and selling of slaves.
Yeah, and so the English are not innocent at all either. So the English, when they came to the Northeast, especially, there was a fair amount of slavery of the Wampanoags, and it was it's so similar to the Mormon Indian Student Placement Program. They would bring kids into the household as servants, and they would educate them. And in fact, in those early days, in the 16th, 17th century, that there was a deliberate effort to educate these children. It kind of declined later, but that was a big part of the English economy. Was those children working in English households in Boston and places like that, and the English aren't innocent at all. Obviously, the story of people being involuntarily captured and brought from Africa kind of becomes the big story of slavery in the Americas, and often forgotten is the role of indigenous people in that same slave trade. So American Indians were bought and sold alongside Africans, and oftentimes they were mixed. And a lot of African Americans today, when we look at their DNA, have a significant percentage of Native American ancestry. And so, 10, 20% in many cases of their ancestry is indigenous. And it's because they were enslaved together.
Wow, that's interesting. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Thomas Murphy. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about an unusual invitation that Tom received from a very unusual source.
Then a few weeks later, I get an email asking me if I'd come to BYU and present an article on DNA in the Book of Mormon. And I'm like, I remembered what happened back in 2002. And I remembered that, I expected, I had been in correspondence with people like Scott Woodward Scott Woodward's related to my wife through marriage.
He's a professor at BYU, right?
Yeah, yeah.
For those of you who are interested in the entire interview uncut without any interruptions, sign up at patreon.com/gospeltangents and you can hear the entire interview for just $5 a month. Also, we have other tiers. If you'd like to subscribe on our website at gospeltangents.com, click on the yellow subscribe button and you can subscribe for $10. You can also do that on Patreon and get a PDF transcript. We've also got some other ones for $15 and $20 if you'd like to get those as well. If you're interested in individual transcripts, go to Amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview, and you can see our past interviews there in paperback form. So just check out Gospel Tangents. We're always updating those. For the latest updates on Facebook, go to facebook.com/gospeltangents, and you can see our latest updates there. We're also on Twitter at Gospel Tangents. Of course, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. And please give us a 5-star rating for those of you who listen to audio only. So once again, thanks for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again.